Hello and welcome to the Athletic FC podcast with me, Ayo Akinwolere. Today we're focusing on the 4 winless clubs in the Premier League: Southampton, Wolves, Ipswich Town and Crystal Palace. So what can these clubs do to avoid being cut adrift and their manager getting sacked? Joining me is the Athletic's Phil Hay and also Tim Spiers as well. Yeah, Tim, good to have you with us. I know you haven't been on the pod for a while, but we're going to have to start with you as our resident Wolves fan. And bear with me, I've got a whole heap of stats here. I just want you to take it comfortably because Gary O'Neill's side have started this season with 0 wins, 1 draw and 6 losses in 7 Premier League games. Also, a minus 12 goal difference. I look at the players Wolves have right now and I've seen them play great football and they're experienced in the Premier League. Why do you think it's gone so badly this season?
Oh, jeez. It's going to feel like therapy, isn't it, I think?
Please talk to me.
Safe
space here, mate.
Yeah, we've got a couch. I mean, you know, kind of short term, I think they had a bit of an iffy summer in the transfer market, and O'Neill's kind of lost his mojo a bit and maybe made some bad tactical decisions. But I think there's definitely a bigger picture at Wolves in terms of a byproduct of a club that's drifting quite a lot. I mean, you know, if you look quickly at Wolves' journey, going from mid-table championship club to 7th place in the Premier League twice in a row and a Europa League quarter-final in the space of 4 years. You know, and they spent a lot of money to get there, and they had a special manager in Nuno and a special agent in Jorge Mendes. But then to get to that level and then to cement where you are takes probably the same amount of spending again, and it takes revenue and income streams that the club hasn't had before, and I guess with the ownership they've got, very sort of pragmatic owners that want the clubs to be self-sustainable and to look to long term. They're not just going to throw money at it and put the club in sort of financial jeopardy. So what you've sort of seen in the 4 years since is things going a bit stale, and obviously Nuno left, and you've had a churn of managers and some poor recruitment, which really can put you back. If you spend 35 million on Fabio Silva and 29 million on Gonçalo Guedes, and neither of them do anything, then that's a huge chunk of money and can really set you back by sort of a year. And the fans have really turned now. They're questioning the owners for the first time away at Brentford at the weekend. There was some anti-Fosun chants, questioning the manager as well, and rightly sort of questioning what is the plan for this club. What are the ambitions? Where are you looking to take us? Where's the investment? Where's the stadium improvements, which have never come? So I think to have like an incredible cycle is one thing, and Villa and Newcastle are sort of still going through that now and enjoying that. But to repeat that success with your next manager, when Emery leaves or when Eddie Howe leaves, and the next set of players that come through without spending sort of crazy money is almost impossible, really. It highlights the amazing work that Brighton are doing, by the way, year on year. I know
that's an incredible scouting network. That's an incredible infrastructure
totally.
as well.
So you need those foundations. And I know we're talking about sort of bad football teams here and how can they stay up. But I do think there's a question of, and we've seen this before, of the Premier League sort of beating teams down after a while, because if you've got nothing to aim and achieve for, then you're going to get sort of sucked into that whirlpool and you're going to get relegated at some point. And then we've seen with Middlesbrough, Stoke, Watford, Swansea, teams that have spent a number of years in the Premier League, and once you get down, it's so hard to come back up. And once you've got over, and Phil will know this, once you've got over enjoying that first year of the excitement of the Premier League, the away days, match of the day, full houses every week, the great signings for 2-3 years, it's so hard to sort of keep that going. And I can definitely feel that lack of excitement at Wolves. I mean, they had Liverpool at home a couple of weeks ago on a Saturday night, and it was so flat. And they only lost 2-1 and they were in the game, but even at kickoff, it was just so quiet because, that excitement's really gone. And I think for the owners as well, that excitement has sort of gone, and there's a real realism of how much you need to spend to actually, try and achieve something in the Premier League. So yeah, I guess you're going to get caught out once in a while if you have a bad year of recruitment, and Wolves are struggling at the moment.
Yeah,
sure.
Phil, I'm going to come to you very quickly in a sec, but just before we move on, Tim, I'm looking at Wolves' fixtures post the international break. Manchester City at home, Brighton away. Wolves have just come off a 5-3 defeat against Brentford. Gary O'Neill's going to be an interesting one moving forward, and whether or not he has the opportunity to carry on as manager at Wolves. Those 2 games are really defining, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, Wolves fans don't want to hear this anymore, after shipping 5 at Brentford away at the weekend, but they have had the hardest opening run of any team. In their opening 9 games, they've played the top 7. And their other 2 were against Forest and Brentford, who are both going pretty well. So they've had a horrible run, and like you say, Man City and Brighton next. It's not a flawless excuse because Nuno's Wolves would take on and beat these big boys, but after City and Brighton, you've got basically a fixture compiler's dream of all the teams sort of in and around them. But there's going to be enormous pressure if O'Neill gets that far on those games. If you can get through City and Brighton, then I think it's Palace and Southampton at home. You go 1-0 down in one of those, and the whole place is going to be toxic, like it was in the away end at Brentford at the weekend. So, personally, I think Wolves' squad is a mid-table squad looking upwards.
Okay.
Certainly in an attacking sense. So O'Neill hasn't got that as an excuse. He can't say the squad isn't good enough. Personally, I think the squad they have is probably suited to a more sort of tactically astute manager. With maybe loftier ambitions, but at the moment, the defence is absolutely abominable. If they played Walsall tomorrow, they wouldn't keep a clean sheet. No offence to Walsall, but
bad.
Insert your lower league club of choice here.
I know what you're talking about.
So that was definite offence to Walsall.
Yeah, well, it's a Midland thing. It's a Midland thing. Leave him alone.
But the Brentford game, they must have conceded about 10 free headers, including one in the second minute and then 1-0 down. They're not jumping for crosses, and there are real weak links there, which O'Neill's not going to be able to fix in the short term.
Okay, Phil. We'll talk about Palace, Ipswich, and Southampton later on in the show, but we talk about winless clubs, and those we've got our 4 now. October is typically sacking season. We said potentially Gary O'Neill looks like he's in a very precarious position now with how Wolves have started their season. Which one of the managers out of those 4 teams do you, in your eyes, think needs to be a bit wary of their job moving forward?
I would say there are 2 obvious ones. Tim touched on something really interesting there, and I feel more and more that Brighton seem to have created this thing of being able to enjoy season after season. They seem to have got the knack of that in the Premier League, and they almost need to bottle and sell it to everybody else, because there's always this clutch of clubs who, no matter how high they finish up the league and no matter how comfortable they feel in the Premier League, are always at risk of being sucked back into what goes on at the bottom of it. It really isn't very long. It's a great example. Since people were talking about how much they like the Leicester City model, I remember Leeds focusing a lot on what they used to call the Leicester model, which was make very good signings at kind of relatively low cost, sell for big money and big profits that you can reinvest, and in the meantime win trophies, in Leicester's case the Premier League and the FA Cup. Nobody talks about the Leicester model anymore because it ground to a halt and they went down. And, I would caution against, as much as I admire Brighton, and I do think they're onto a really good thing there, I would caution against them being out of trouble indefinitely. In the same way that Brentford, after some good seasons, have kind of got sucked in a little bit more. To look at the table as it is at the moment, and particularly the 4 clubs with no wins, I think the side who are in most trouble without any doubt is Southampton. And I do think they're starting to smell of managerial change somewhere between mid-October and mid-November, because they haven't got going. I still think, though, that the most despondent dressing room will be Wolves. There was a very good piece done in the summer by Adam Crafton, who was over in America when Wolves were on tour for pre-season there. And he did a broad piece on the club and the squad and the preparation, but also a lot of work on, a lot of the coverage was of Gary O'Neill himself. And Wolves did, every base covered, in the sense of things like taking 3 pillows for each player so they got a good night's sleep, the kind of minute detail. And I think, to be fair to O'Neill, looking back at that piece as I have this week, you couldn't say that any of this is a dereliction of duty on his part. He genuinely did everything to prepare them and to have them prepared for the start of the season. There was a lot of work went into it. But as happens, and as tends to happen with clubs season after season, it just isn't working. And I get the sense that Wolves will be really reluctant to break from this and will want to see him punch his way out of trouble. But this can't go on much longer. And I do think another couple of results are going to leave him very close to the fire.
So you're saying Southampton and Wolves really should be thinking about what happens with their manager moving forward?
I think so, yeah.
Okay, right, time to talk about Crystal Palace and get their perspective on things. Let's hear from the Athletic's Dom Fifield on where it's all gone wrong for Oliver Glasner's side.
So why are Palace not clicking? Well, this season to date has been something of the perfect storm for Oliver Glasner. Palace had 7 players involved in the finals of major tournaments over the summer, the Euro 2024, the Copa America and the Olympics, which clearly disrupted pre-season. And I think that's potentially more critical at a club of this size and at this squad depth. Those personnel involved are clearly going to be the key players, and yet they've come back either not fit or carrying injuries. Then there's the obvious, the loss of Michael Elise, who had been their creator-in-chief through that glorious run into last season. And his departure for Bayern Munich left a huge void in the side. And now we're in a situation where Eze is attempting to do it all on his own, and is very easy for opposition defenders and opponents' midfielders to concentrate on stifling him in the knowledge that he probably stifled Palace. And I think in general there's been far too much disruption, too many new players attempting to learn the Oliver Glasner way, or if they were familiar with that before, attempting to adjust to the Premier League. And that's going to need time. But there's also the context. We have to remember the context here. We're measuring how Palace should be doing now with what happened at the back end of last season when they won 6 out of 7 matches. But this was actually a group that had been hovering above the relegation zone prior to that. So we probably need a bit of realism here, which is, in fairness, what Oliver Glasner has been attempting to stress in all his media briefings to date this season.
Yeah, Dom Fifield there on the Palace perspective. Phil, does Dom make a fair point there, in terms of our expectations around Palace, considering how they ended last season? It looked like it was beautiful, actually. Football was great. They were winning games. But, even Oliver Glasner said, in a press conference after his first match with Palace, of my first 8 games in Frankfurt at his previous club, Frankfurt, there were 5 draws and 3 losses. Then the journey started. First press conference that was. Should we just take it into consideration that they've lost personnel and it might take a bit of time for things to move forward?
Yeah, I don't think, it's necessary for Glasner to start every job slowly just because it happened previously at Eintracht. But listening to Dom's comments, I think the reasons that he puts forward for Palace having a slow start are very valid. And I think using them, you can piece an argument together for why there's a reasonable to good chance that it will get better. The summer was quite disruptive for Palace, and I don't think there was ever going to be much of a way of replacing Michael Elise. I think had they lost Eze as well, it would have left them very, very short. And I think would have removed a big part of what is good about that Palace team. But they do have good attacking resources, which means that they will win games. And that makes a big difference at the bottom of the table. They've got Nketiah, who I think is a good signing without him ever seeming to me to be the kind of perfect Premier League number 9 in an all-round sense. I think will do good things for them. They've got Mateta, they've got Edouard, who I still think can contribute. And I feel as if Palace will be okay, and I feel as if Glasner is the sort of coach that you should be sticking it out with and you should be backing. I mean, the same rules apply. These sort of runs can't go on indefinitely, and at some point you've got to turn the corner. But I get the sense that Palace will. I think it will come, and I feel like when I listen to Glasner talk about it, I can kind of hear credibility in what he's saying. I think it's a valid point. I think that there are reasons to think that they will pick up, and I think he's got the players to do that.
Yeah, Phil talks about the players that Palace have lost, but also players they've brought in. Tim, what about from a Wolves perspective? Neto gone, Kilman gone. In terms of recruitment, thoughts?
I mean, those 2 players were sold for £90 million, and neither of them were replaced. That's like, I don't know, it's almost dereliction of duty, really. Like Kilman, they basically said, right, Yerson Mosquera, who's Colombian centre-half, pretty young, been out on loan for a few years, including at Villarreal. They was like, right, it's your job to replace Kilman. I mean, he's still sort of learning on the job, and now he's got an ACL and he's out for the season. And that's it. They didn't sign another centre-back. It's left them really short. If you want to go 5 at the back, like O'Neill's now considering to shore things up, they've got 3 centre-halves to do that. One of those is Craig Dawson, who's getting on a bit. So, yeah, and then Neto went for 50 million. Again, was not replaced with a senior player. Wolves have got probably a contractually obliged thing where they have to sign a Portuguese winger every summer. But they signed two.
Is that true?
No.
You had me shaking my head, and I was like, "What?" Drops the exclusive, but I know what you mean. It seems like they do.
Yeah, absolutely. Anyway, they signed two this summer, but both really young. Rodrigo Gomez, 21, Carlos Forbes, 20. So yeah, there's a Neto-shaped hole and a Kilman-shaped hole. Instead, Wolves went out and spent 20 million on Andre, who's Brazilian international midfielder and looks very good, but not necessarily an area that they needed strengthening because they got Mario Lemina and João Gomez. And then they spent 10 million on Sam Johnston to replace Jose Sarr, who's on the bench. Arguably a downgrade, to be honest. I mean, Johnston's really struggled, made a couple of mistakes, not great playing out from the back. So it's a bit of a strange one, really. They focused their recruitment in sort of areas where they didn't necessarily need to. And now they're really short the back. And people are saying maybe Paul Dummett can come in on a free to come and help out. And it's like, come on, you've had all summer to think about this. So, yeah. And as for Palace, I mean, I think Matt Woosnam was, our Palace guy, was saying it was almost a disastrous window up until the final day or two when they brought in sort of 3 or 4 players, including Nketiah. I mean, obviously, Anderson, who's almost as big a loss as Elise, went, sold to Fulham, which I thought was a really strange move for one of your sort of rivals for a mid-table spot. I mean, they kept Gay and Eze, but Chalobah didn't look too good at the weekend. A weird one with Palace is that they're playing 3-4-3, but they haven't got any cover at wing back. So the second half against Liverpool at the weekend, they had Ismaila Sarr as right wing back and Nathaniel Klein as left wing back. That's not great, below the depth of your first choice players. So yeah, I think most Palace fans would say they did not have a good summer of recruitment.
Yeah, Phil, think about the newly promoted sides here. Ipswich spending, 100 million, 10 new signings. Southampton spending about the same, 20 new signings. I just wonder how difficult that is to integrate so many players into a squad, into a step up from the Championship, and a team that have never really played before, and then expect quick results.
It is difficult, and I think as the years go on, it becomes more and more difficult. I imagine Tim will agree with me here that very often you'll watch teams in the Championship, some at the very top end of it, those that win the league or get promoted. And despite where they are, and despite how competitive and strong they are in that league, you find yourself asking how many of those players are going to be able to transition well to the Premier League. And quite often the answer is not many or not enough. So you have very little option but to spend heavily and to bring big numbers in. I think you then have the issue of persuading really good players that they want to come to clubs who are automatically going to be at a certain amount of risk of relegation. And then in the case of Ipswich, because of that or because of budget or whatever else, you find yourself investing in players who either haven't played consistently or regularly in the Premier League before or are going into it for the first time. So in the case of Ipswich, people like Jacob Greaves and Jack Clark, even Liam Delap coming from Manchester City, is a City player, but no track record in the Premier League and has started very well. But again, a little bit uncertain. Same with like Schmoddix from Blackburn. I think the difference with clubs like Southampton and Ipswich is they can cut the cloth in terms of expectation by knowing when they go into the league what they're going to be looking at and what it is that they need to do. They're going to be part of the bun fight. It's slightly different at Wolves, who shouldn't really be in this position. But it does so often come back to recruitment every time, no matter what a coach is doing, no matter what a manager is doing. As you saw with Leicester and their decline, poor recruitment is so often what drags a team down.
Yeah, completely agree. Like I said, you sort of go in year to year, really, and if you have a bad summer, it can seriously set you back. And we've seen that with a number of clubs. So that puts an awful lot of pressure on the recruitment team. That puts a lot of pressure on the head coach being aligned with that. And obviously you've got a churn of managers. What's your average Premier League lifespan of a manager? 12 to 18 months. So to keep that consistency over sort of 2, 3, 4 years is extremely difficult.
Yeah, Phil, having watched Leeds and covered them for a while, at what point do these newly promoted clubs or clubs in general start worrying or start thinking about relegation? I mean, your first 6, 7 matches in the Premier League so far, no wins. Surely that is cause for concern for a lot of the teams we're talking about right now.
From experience, I would say that October is the time when thoughts in the boardroom about changing manager, sacking a manager start to crystallise. I saw this in 2022-23 with Leeds and Jesse Marsh. He was in a lot of trouble towards the end of that October. But what happened was that he got himself an admittedly very good win against Liverpool at Anfield, and then a fairly unstructured, fortuitous win against Bournemouth at Ellen Road. And it bought him some breathing space just at the point where it looked like he was about to hit the wall. Now, that season was a bit unusual because we had the World Cup break. And had it not been for that, I think there's a chance that he would have run out of road much sooner than he did. But I'm right in saying, I think, and it was interesting to hear this, that since then, the chief executive at Leeds, Angus Kinnear, has said, with hindsight and looking back, it was a mistake not to make a change at that point. They should have done. And they should have bitten the bullet and just said, this isn't working out, and they regretted not doing that. But there's definitely another factor at play here as well with certain clubs, which is the influence of the crowd. I mean, in Marsh's case, he didn't have the backing of the support at Leeds. He didn't have their faith. And to be frank, I don't think there were many of us in the media who thought at that early stage it was going to work either. And what happens, and you're seeing this with O'Neill, I was reading the reports, about them chanting, "You don't know what you're doing" to Gary O'Neill at Brentford on Saturday. You get into a vicious circle where manager needs results, to improve the table, but also to placate the crowd. But because the crowd are on his case and he's losing them, that makes it harder and harder to get results on the board. And you do find that even sometimes with great reluctance, a board at a club decides that, for want of a better phrase, they have very little option but to drain the swamp. And as I say, I don't think Wolves will be desperate to rush into getting rid of Gary O'Neill, but there just comes a point where it feels like the point of no return.
Does that feel like it's getting there with Wolves? Point of no return? Because fans, I mean, that's historically a really fascinating one, isn't it? That relationship between fans and management and their team.
Yeah, it's an interesting one with Wolves. I mean, George Mendes has got them out of trouble in the past, and they have sort of moved away from him in the past couple of years. It was always a sort of an internal argument at Wolves, because obviously they've got their own in-house recruitment team and sporting director or technical director, and often you'd have that side of the club would be scouting their own players and pushing players forward. And then you'd have Mendes saying, well, no, I've got this guy or I've got this guy. And it would cause a bit of conflict. I mean, the classic example, I think it was January 2020, when they needed a winger that transfer window, and they ended up signing Daniel Podence,
right,
who's a George Mendes client, obviously a Portuguese winger.
I can see what's going on here.
Not contractually obliged. Yeah. But the recruitment team were pushing for Danny Olmo.
Okay.
I can't remember where he was at the time, but he was an option and the money was right, sort of 20, 30 million. But, they sided with Mendes on that one. And there were quite a few examples of that, and the recruitment team was sort of banging their head against the door and saying, look, we've got these great players who are a perfect fit, but because Mendes had done so much good for Wolves in terms of giving them Ruben Neves and Diogo Jota in the Championship for 15 million quid, and Nuno obviously as well. So that's an awkward one for Wolves now going forward, is that once you've moved away from your sort of trump card, because obviously everyone else is shopping in the same supermarket, right? Unless you're Brighton and going to Ecuador, or you're Wolves and you're going with a special relationship with Portugal, everybody else is scouting the same players and looking at the same players. So, but yeah, in terms of Wolves this season, like I said, bringing it back to Mendes, I do wonder if they'll move back to him perhaps in January, because they can't afford to go down. Fosun are an investment company, and they literally, they're going to protect their asset, and there's no way that they'll sort of allow Wolves to be relegated, because it would be hugely damaging and detrimental to what they're trying to do. So if O'Neill's still struggling in a few weeks' time, perhaps they'll go back to Mendes and see if he can get them
a Portuguese manager or
maybe,
a Portuguese coach,
or someone like like obviously Julian Lopetegui joined them a couple of years ago when they were at the bottom of the league. There's no way they'd have managed to do that without Mendes, and he can still pull rabbits out of the hat in the transfer market. So that's why I'm not hugely concerned yet, because I think Fosun and Wolves will do all it takes to keep this club in the Premier League.
Okay. Well, Phil, there's lots of talk around the style of play for teams, lower in the table, and it seems like they're now looking to play possession-based football rather than counter-attacking football. I mean, we're not coaches, we're not management, but do you think this is the right approach?
I don't think it's a prerequisite that if you come into the division and you're one of the weaker teams in it, that you have to counter-attack or concede the greater share of possession. I don't think you have to commit to playing without the ball. I think there's certain teams in the Premier League who if you try to fight on the possession front with, I mean, Manchester City being the obvious one, then you're going to come off second best, and it's not much of a strategy. Going toe-to-toe with them just isn't going to work. in the same way, I don't think coming up and playing possession football just because it's in vogue, although I would suggest that it's slightly less in vogue now than it was maybe 3 or 4 years ago, is automatically the thing to do. I would say that the key aspect of this is to be adaptable when you have to be. And Tim was talking about Gary O'Neill possibly going to 5 at the back in order to change it, which is a kind of break from the plan. But if it isn't working, then you need to come up with a solution. And I think one of the problems for Russell Martin in particular at Southampton is that he is massively wedded to what he would call Plan A, which is possession-based style, and seems totally loath to break from that. And again, I can relate to that because I watched that with Marcelo Bielsa, who was 100% going to go out on his shield in the season when he was sacked by Leeds and when Leeds got into relegation trouble. The way he played was the way he played, and that was it. And to a degree, there's something to admire about that. That you will, if you want to call it, stick to your principles, but you have to be careful that philosophy doesn't become dogma. And I think if it isn't working, there's not a lot of virtue for somebody like Martin in saying, well, this is the way we play and this is what we do. Eventually, Southampton at the very top are probably going to say, well, I'll tell you what, we'll get somebody else who will actually deliver some results and make this work and give us a chance of staying up. I think by default, you'll find that more and more clubs lower down the table will play on the counter and will play without possession. But I don't think it solely comes down to that.
Yeah, you were nodding when he was talking about changing the style. Sticking to your principles, but man, this is survival, Tim.
Yeah, I kind of feel like maybe Vincent Kompany getting the Bayern job was one of the worst things that could happen for fans. For fans of
get it completely wrong and get a big job somewhere else.
Yeah, if you're a fan of a team in the bottom 5 or 6 of the Premier League, that was horrendous news. To be honest, I feel like I'd be surprised if Martin changed his style. He seems very principled, like Kompany was, and they're very, very good at keeping the ball. And he'll probably think, do you know what? A bit of a tweak in the final third, and that starts to click, then we'll rise the table quite quickly. He'll probably think that the riskier approach would be just forgetting all that, forgetting what they've done for the past 12 or so months, and completely changing the style. That might be even more risky. But what it also does is it keeps his sort of reputation for playing, attractive football. And when it comes to his next job, which won't be far away, as we've said, he's not going to be at Southampton for 10 years. He can say, look, we were trying to play great football. Recruitment was the issue. Jason Wilcox leaving in the summer was the issue. The guy upstairs got it wrong. Give me better players, and what I was trying to do at Southampton will work. If Vincent Kompany had gone 4-4-2 last season, direct, long balls, set pieces, and Burnley had finished 15th, would he have got the Bayern job? I would say absolutely not. So managers will look at that, and Gary O'Neill, I think, is doing the same to an extent, or certainly has done, playing 4 at the back, trying to keep it pretty open. They're sort of, that they're playing for themselves, I guess, maybe. I don't know if that's fair or not. Maybe him and Russell Martin are kind of thinking of their next jobs more than keep Wolves or Southampton up at all costs. And that's fair enough, really. You've got to look out for yourself at the end of the day.
Yeah, Phil, Tim makes a really good point. And we spoke about this just before we started recording. The fact that managers, if things aren't going that well, potentially have got their eyes somewhere else. I mean, Bielsa is international management now, and he's done the rounds as a manager with the same front foot style.
Oh, very much so. It's worked for him in various places. Hasn't worked at certain others, or hasn't, worked indefinitely. There's always come a point with it. I think, to be fair to Bielsa, no way at Leeds was he looking at other jobs. And I do accept, and I thought this at the time with him, and I think it's fair to say of Martin and Gary O'Neill as well. It's not easy to totally adapt style mid-season. And Bielsa's argument was always that it doesn't engender confidence in the dressing room either. If for so long you've kind of banged the drum about we play like this, we do X, we do Y, we absolutely don't do Z. This is the strategy and we stick to it no matter what. And then when the results turn and it gets difficult, you suddenly say to the players, actually, we are going to abandon that because it's not working. Bielsa's point was always, well, they realise that you have no confidence in what you're doing, and therefore, they start to lose confidence in you. I think there is, though, place in the game for pragmatism. And Tim's right about Kompany. I mean, he did go out on his shield in the Premier League, and it's left Burnley in an okay state. I mean, they are very much in the mix in the Championship, but they certainly aren't going to win the title in the same way that he won it previously. They've got Scott Parker, who is a kind of proven promotion winner in the Championship, but by no means is a particularly enthralling coach when it comes to the football he sells up to watch. It might work for them, but I don't know whether in the long term Burnley will feel that the company era was good for them or not. I suspect they probably will, but it's pretty borderline at the moment.
And yeah, just to say, one team we're not talking about today is Leicester, who did finally get their first win. And who's getting the most stick at the moment, probably? Steve Cooper, who's the one that's sort of less bothered about an identity and playing great football. And he's sort of a bit more win at all costs, Steve Cooper.
Yeah, I mean, we could probably see them down there as well, so very soon.
Yeah,
so let's save that for another pod. Well, let's talk about the growing gap between the big and small clubs in the Premier League. Let's hear from the Athletic's Liam Tharm.
But I looked at the points accumulated by the Premier League sort of bottom three, the relegated trio in each season, and it's massively trended downwards, quite consistently. It was down to 66 points, all three of them last season. In the early and mid sort of 2000s, it was up in the 90s quite comfortably. It was up in the hundreds in the first few 20-team Premier League seasons. So
that was Liam Tharm on last week's episode of the Athletic FC Football Tactics podcast, talking about how points totals from the bottom three in the Premier League have trended downwards over time. Phil, why do you think that is? Because I'm thinking about Southampton and Leeds, right? Two teams that went through the playoffs. But how much difference is there in quality between these two teams?
Not necessarily between the two teams, but there's a big gap between the divisions, which is where the problem lies. It becomes harder and harder in the Championship to attract Premier League standard players to the division because, frankly, a lot of them don't want to play there. Same applies to coaches as well. If they think they're of Premier League stock, they don't particularly want to risk their reputations in the Championship, and they know that it only takes a couple of bad seasons down there before the stock is diminished. And I guess it goes back to what I was saying previously about the fact that when you get promoted, you don't necessarily take a lot of outstanding top flight players with you, and if you can't address that quickly, you're automatically going to be at the bottom end of the division. I think there's something to be said as well for the way in which the teams at the very top, City and Arsenal in particular, but you saw it with Liverpool under Klopp, are getting so much stronger and so much more consistent in avoiding defeats and picking up wins. I was having a look back today at and okay, it was just one example, but I think it was the 96-97 season, which where Manchester United won the title with 75 points. And that would have got them fourth last season, and they'd have been a long way behind Manchester City. So I think when points are shifting so, en masse to clubs at the top end, your teams down the bottom are going to get left behind more and more. But I suspect that the real answer to this is the gulf between the Championship and the Premier League, which is only getting wider, gets wider each season, makes it more difficult to bounce from one to the other. I mean, I don't think you'll necessarily find a team or a club better set up for that step than Ipswich, just because of how consistent they've been under McKenna, how long McKenna had been in the job, how good they've been under him, and how used they were to winning. But cold hard facts are, if you look at their squad, it's a long way short of what you really need to be uber competitive in the Premier League, which makes it extremely difficult for them. And even somebody who's as settled in that role and is, you would say, as safe in that role as McKenna is going to find this a long, hard year.
Yeah, do you think that gap will grow as the leagues go on?
I mean,
even further.
History tells us so, right? You go back 40, 50 years, Forest coming up and winning the league in the first year, or Watford in the 80s coming up and finished second. Those days are long gone. And then you in sort of Premier League times, Charlton came up and did well, or Hull came up and were in the Champions League positions early on. That doesn't happen anymore. You look at the league table right now; it's so predictable. The top three, the teams that are struggling. It's all. Fulham doing okay, but other than that, you could really predict how this table was going to look a few weeks ago. That makes for a pretty boring league, I think.
Grim, isn't it?
And it even goes down to sort of the Championship now. As Phil will know, you look at the top half of the Championship, and there's lots of familiar former Premier League clubs there. Obviously, Sheffield United, Burnley, West Brom, Leeds, Watford, Norwich, Middlesbrough were there for quite some time, Swansea. And then the bottom half is full of teams who haven't been in the Premier League, like Millwall, Preston, Coventry, Bristol City, Portsmouth and QPR haven't been there for a while. So it's even dropping down to the Championship now as well. It's not good, all this predictability.
There's probably only one team in the last 10 years in the Championship who have been perfectly set up to jump from one division to the other. I mean, as it turned out, Bielsa's Leeds were very ready for it, but I think that came down as much as anything to the standard of his coaching as the individual players that they had. But in former jobs, Tim and I used to sit together in press boxes.
Good
Tim at
days.
Rose,
Good old days, eh?
yeah, halcyon days, yeah. And me at Leeds, and occasionally we'd share the same one. And I remember watching that Nuno team with Jota and Neves and Bolly, and you knew what was going on there because you were seeing the results and you were hearing the reports. But when you watched them in the flesh, in the Championship, Neves in particular, I felt, but all three of them, and there were others who were very good as well, you felt that you were watching not only Premier League players, but kind of almost Champions League standard players. And they were so good and so far apart from the average, level in the Championship that you knew they were going to win the title at a canter. And the reason for that was that Mendes was able for Wolves to serve up that calibre of footballer. But generally, it just doesn't happen. I don't think there'll be another occasion where you see a Championship club with players who look, so far out of the actual depth they should be playing in, which is a million miles that direction in much deeper water. It was so easy for Wolves that season. It was unbelievable.
Tim, how we talked about Mendes. How did Wolves manage to really do that? Because if I think about it, the kind of money people are making in the Championship, it's decent money. That's more than a lot of money than a lot of other leagues across the whole of Europe. Do you just basically try and figure out selling this product to someone? Did Mendes know that this was the big ambition for Wolves, that, we go into the Premier League and this is what we have to do? I mean, because, I can't see it being that hard to convince someone if their money's right and you say, look, in a year's time, we're banging for the Premier League.
I think with his particular cases, it was a result of the work he's done over many decades in terms of building up his agency, and not just farming all these players onto that agency, onto Gestafe, but also the way he treats them. They'll talk about him being like a father figure and a very sort of personable, likable guy. He's Nuno's best mate as well for a start. So a lot of them didn't take much persuading, believe it or not, and I think it was such a cliche, but the project, but it was.
But it's true. That's what I mean. Like, you've got to persuade them on the project and where
totally.
they might end up.
Yeah, and you needed Neves to be the first one for the rest to say, look, oh wow, if Neves is there, then maybe it's going to be worth it. But obviously, it was very high risk. If it was all down to the manager, if Wolves hadn't got the manager in place, then they might have struggled to get out of that division. And then I think they were 57 million in the red that season. So if they hadn't gone up that first season or that second season, they'd have been in big trouble. So it's not necessarily the safest or the smartest way to do it, because it was, like I said, it was very high risk financially, and that's the dilemma that sort of Wrexham and Birmingham will have when they come up, because it's not just going to be a case of buying the league. You do need those sort of special arrangements like Wolves had with Mendes, or like I said, like Brighton have got their recruitment team. You've got to try and do things differently.
Where are the glimmers of hope for Wolves this season? I'm giving you an opportunity to redeem yourself. and this last chat we've just had, like, where genuinely can they look at positives? What can potentially turn this around? Because, for Gary O'Neill, I mean, I look at it and I'm thinking there's also a shift of mindset, right? Like, every goal, every defeat must feel like a blow for a team that feels like they just can't get out of gear. Wolves seem to start well, but they just dwindle as matches progress. Yeah,
that is a concern. We can talk about the fixture list all we want, but they've obviously got a huge confidence problem. So when it comes to playing Palace and Southampton at home, can they just brush off the fact that they've had this horrendous start to the season? I would say, talking earlier about how Fosun really can't afford for Wolves to go down, I do think they'd give it everything in January to keep the team up if they're still really struggling at that point, and getting a manager to keep them up if O'Neill's still struggling. The squad, I'm not going to say too good to go down, because that's the kind of thing that comes back to bite you. But the squad is more than good enough to stay up. They've got two current Brazil internationals in their midfield. I mean,
Richarlison is also a Brazilian.
Fair. But young and very, very talented midfielders in João Gomes and Andre. Mateus Cunha, an exceptional talent. I know Hwang's really struggled recently, but he was a prolific goal scorer at times for Wolves last season. Strand Larsen, who's sort of Haaland's backup at Norway, scored 13 last season for Celta Vigo. So we should be absolutely fine in theory, and I do think the quality of the teams around them is definitely weaker, and you hope that over 38 games Wolves show that hope.
Hope, and that's what's what keeps us loving this game. Phil, you said earlier that you think Glaston's team will be fine with the likes of the recruitment they've brought in, but then we look at Ipswich and we look at Southampton. Any glimmer of hope from where you're sitting as to how either of those teams can stay in the Premier League this season?
I think the hope at Ipswich will be the McKenna effect, and that should be a dressing room and a club that holds together pretty well under pressure, and doesn't just flake apart at the first sign of trouble. I did say that about Palace. I also think Wolves will stay up. I'm just not sure that they're going to stay up with O'Neill. I think he's in that really dicey period at the moment now where he doesn't even have really the leeway of another 3 or 4 bad weeks. I just don't think the crowd are going to allow that. I think Wolves will twitch at some point if that carries on. But having seen Wolves at the best under O'Neill, you still like to think that there's a little bit of hope for him there yet. And Tim is absolutely right. It's not as if it's only these 4 teams who are in it. You know, there are issues at Everton, there are issues at Leicester. Yeah. We haven't mentioned West Ham once in this conversation, but before their win over Ipswich at the weekend, you know, the narrative did seem to be about how long Lopetegui was going to be able to stick that out. And as it turns out, you know, one big win and suddenly everybody kind of moves on a little bit. So it is starting to take shape without any doubt, and I think you're already beginning to see the teams who are going to be fighting it out there. But as I say, I think Palace will get their act together. I think Wolves will have enough. I just wonder whether that turn will come quick enough for O'Neill.
Yeah, I mean, Man United are 14th as well. Oops, I didn't mention that. Didn't mention that, but that's another podcast again. Anyway,
go
gents.
on, Tim. You get into this one.
No, I'll leave it. I think.
Leave it, yeah. Cheers, gents. We really appreciate your time and thanks for joining us on the pod as per usual. And we'll be back tomorrow for another podcast. Thanks for listening. If you want to watch more episodes of the show, please subscribe to the channel. We'll be joined by the likes of David Ornstein, Matt Slater, Adam Crafton, Carl Anker, and plenty more through the season. If you'd like to listen to the episodes in full in audio form, search The Athletic FC wherever you get your podcasts from.